Hi, welcome back to the Yacht Report podcast. It has been a while since we did one of these. I think the last one we did was in October 2024. It wasn't deliberate, it just kind of happened. It's time flies when you're busy. So yeah, I apologize for that. Hopefully we'll be able to move on in a more positive way and get some more podcasts out. We're here to talk about the Bayesian. We're going to go through a brief recap of the events. Everybody knows what happened by now, but we'll just go through it just in case somebody is forgotten or the little bit behind with the series of events. We'll talk about the immediate aftermath. We'll talk about some of the controversies, Centerboard, up or down, did it matter, things like that. We'll talk about the recap of the salvage operations, which are going on right behind me right now. You probably can't see it. If you're watching on YouTube, just behind this bush here is a Hebel Lift 10 and Hebel Lift 2, which are working on the salvage, and they're progressing as well, which I'll go into a little bit later. And we'll talk about the MAIB report, which is the Marine Accident Investigation Branch. We'll talk about what they had to say and stability, and then we'll talk about the windage on the Bayesian. We'll go into that in more detail. So we're going to take one section of the episode as well. We're going to put it onto YouTube, where we're going to talk about the lawyer for Ricardo Thomas, the person who's been hired, I assume, by his family, because obviously he passed away in this incident. And he's been saying some things on the Italian television. I'm going to go through them. I'm going to say why I think that they're not accurate. So anyway, we'll start at the beginning. And 19th of August 2024, Bayesian sank approximately 3 o'clock here in the morning, local time. And there were 7 fatalities, including one of the crew, like I just mentioned, Ricardo Thomas, and 6 guests, including Mike Lynch, whose wife is the owner of the Bayesian on paper. I believe she was the owner on paper, but I believe it was his yacht, if you know what I mean. He was the one who was in love with it. She didn't particularly like it, which probably saved her life, to be honest. Now, along with Mike Lynch, who died, his daughter, his 18-year-old, or their 18-year-old daughter died as well, Hannah. Jonathan Bloomer and his wife Judith also died. And lawyer Chris Movillo and his wife Nada. And, like I said, the chef, Ricardo Thomas, they all perished in this incident. There were 15 survivors, including Mike Lynch's wife, Angela Baccaris, and 5 guests, and James Cuffield, the captain, and there were also 8 other members of the crew who survived. Now, if you cast your mind back to that day, because it happened at early hours of the morning, so the 19th, the aftermath of it, they were still searching for survivors. The Italians did an incredible job. They brought in all of these divers from all over Italy, and they were diving on the wreck. And because of the depth, the 50-meter depth, they had limited time on the seabed. I'm not going to go into any technical stuff because I don't know anything about diving. But basically, they had 10 minutes on the seabed, and then they had to come back up, and they had to spend a certain amount of time, at a certain depth before they could come back up to the surface. That's as far as I'm willing to go on that. But they were doing an incredible job, and they did this for days, and they just kept going and kept going and kept going until they recovered. Because initially they were thinking, well, there could be air pockets, there could be people still alive, and unfortunately that was not the case. Those divers, they do something, their job is something that most of us would probably be terrified to do, right? It's such a crazy thing to be diving at those depths. It's so dangerous, as we found out also recently with the salvage operation, where one of the divers was killed. Now, on the same day, I think it was the 19th, it could have been the day after, I'm pretty sure it was the 19th, the CEO of the Italian Sea Group, Giovanni Costantino, he came out publicly and blamed the crew without any evidence. He basically said that the yacht that they built, they didn't build it. Perini Navi built it, which is now part of the Italian Sea Group. But in 2008, it was an independent company. But, like I said, now he now is the owner of that company. He came out and said that the yacht was unsinkable if it was sailed properly. In other words, the crew were to blame. One of his quotes was, "Jesus Christ, the hull is intact. The water came in from hatchways left open. There's no other possible explanation. If maneuvered properly, the boat would have comfortably handled the weather." Comfortably, he said. The statement was false, as we now know, based on data from the stability book that was given by Perini Navi to the owner of the yacht and therefore the crew of the yacht. And also the Marine Accident Investigation Branch's report also created a digital replica of the vessel. Got the University of Southampton to come in and do that, and they do a lot of this work, and they recreated that, and they went into some of the stability issues with the vessel, which we'll go into a little bit later. Another thing that Mr. Costantino said is that he said, "I know everything they know, the crew." This appears to be based on the fact that he has access to all the documents that were created during the build, right? As far as I know, he's never worked at sea. He doesn't have any sea time. He's not an engineer. He's a CEO of a company. So that would be a little bit like me saying, "I know everything the brain surgeon knows because I read the same books that the brain surgeon read," right? Which is crazy. Even another captain with years of experience at sea, or another chief engineer with years of experience at sea on another vessel, wouldn't know what the crew knew, because you could even, I'll go as far as saying that even a captain or a chief engineer that worked on another Perini Navi wouldn't know what the crew knew, because they never worked on that boat, and every boat is different, right? It might have been built the same way as another vessel, but it has a character of its own, like characteristics of sailing and engineering, and the faults that they have, the flaws, the way the engines might hesitate to start up, or whatever it is. That it's like almost like a breathing thing, and you have to spend time on a vessel to learn its idiosyncrasies. So him saying he knows what they know is false. Now, in the weeks that followed, the Italian Sea Group released a series of documents, a set of documents for the media. And they had details of the Bayesian, including some basic GAs, general arrangements, or blueprints, if you like, and data, some basic data on stability. Now, we asked for data from them, and they never replied to us. They never gave us anything. But they gave these same documents out to the Italian press. Now, we managed to get a copy of that document. And in that document, there was a lot of... There was information in there that supported their theory about the sinking of the vessel, right? Even on... They went on a show on Italian television, and I think it was called Porta e Porta. And basically, at the beginning of the TV show, they said, "We're here to figure out how the crew messed up and how much they messed up." That was the start of the show, and Mr. Costantino was on that show, and they weren't saying were the crew to blame. It was how much were they to blame. So it was set up from the beginning that the crew were at fault, right? Now, it might transpire that the crew made some mistakes, right? It's entirely possible. We see a lot of aircraft investigations and stuff where, at the end of the thing, they say the Swiss cheese model, which is where everything sort of lines up, all of these small errors line up, and it creates this big disaster, right? And usually in those scenarios, something that the crew did is part of that problem. Example, they have a flame out on one engine, and then they shut the engine down, but they accidentally shut down the wrong engine, and they end up with no power, right? That's an example of a recent story that was involving an aircraft. So this can happen, but there's no evidence to support that right now. So coming out the day after the incident and saying the crew was to blame is just based on him protecting the brand, as far as it seems, because you have no evidence to support your theory, other than you have an unsinkable vessel, and therefore the fact that it sank it's their fault. That's his claim, right? Now, in this document, they had flawed information in there, like they had digital recreation of the last moments of the vessel from marine traffic or AIS data, which is sent out over VHF radio, right? So AIS is automatic identification system, and it all vessels have it over a certain size, and they broadcast their location, their heading, some other data. Now the data comes from systems on board the vessel. So the GPS gives the position, the gyro heading gives the heading of the vessel, which way it was pointing, rate of turn, sensors, some other data that is combined together on board the vessel and sent through the AIS system. Now we proved that we found an error in the system, not in the system, but the broadcast of VHF data from the Bayesian was missing the gyro heading, which meant that the way it was drawn on marine traffic and other programs, other applications online, was incorrect. It showed the vessel turning because it didn't have the gyro heading. So when the vessel started to head in a different direction, the algorithm of marine traffic, because it was missing that important data, it decided that, oh, it must be turning around, right? Because that data was missing. The other vessel, the Bayesian and Powell, it showed the vessel dragging anchor the same way as the Bayesian, but it showed it dragging anchor with its heading in the correct direction, right? Because they had, and we proved this, they had gyro heading in their AIS transmission. So that was in the Italian Sea Group's report, was this last seconds of the vessel turning to port, and this supported his theory that he said that they'd left the shell door open, which is on the port side of the vessel. So the vessel turning to port supported his theory that the vessel had flooded through that open door. Now the crew said the door was not open, and pictures taken by guests on the Bayesian and Powell around 2100 hours of 9 p.m. the night before the vessel sank showed what appears to be a vessel with a closed shell door. Other things in that report, there were omissions in the report. That, for instance, they talked about the angle of vanishing stability, which is when the vessel leans over to a point where it's unable to return to an upright position, right? And it said in there that the vessel had a 77-degree list, heeling ability with the centerboard up, and an 88-degree with the centerboard down. But what was missing from there was the downflooding angle data. So the downflooding angle was only 43 degrees, which they later confirmed, but that was missing from this document, right? So all of the information in that document supported what Mr. Costantino was saying about the vessel and the fact that it pointed towards crew errors. Now, one of the things that's been talked about a lot, and it even came up recently after the MAIB released their report, a lot of people were asking about the centerboard or the movable keel. And what a centerboard is effectively is, because the vessel had such a massive mast, a 72-meter mast, which was the largest mast in the world at the time, or the largest aluminium mast in the world, 72 meters. At the time, it was the absolutely the largest one. And to counter the wind hitting that, especially when the sails were out, they have, because the vessel, theoretically, the vessel needs to be a certain depth, right? The hull of the vessel needs to have a certain draft. And they don't want to have that because it would limit the ability of that yacht to go into certain marinas, like the one here, because it needs to be 10 meters deep. So what they do is, to get around that, is they have this centerboard that lifts up and down, and it has 60 tons of ballast inside of that board. So when they lower it down, it lowers the center of gravity of the vessel. Now, the centerboard was up at the time of the sinking. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this, including ourselves. We talked about it initially when the vessel first sank, and we learned, as everyone else did, as the story progressed. I've never worked on a sailing yacht, so I worked on motor yachts exclusively and cruise ships before that. So my sailing yacht experience is zero. My knowledge of sailing yachts has come a long way since the sinking of the Bayesian. The stability book that is produced by the manufacturer of the yacht, Perini Navi, and given to the owner and crew. Says in it that the centerboard should be raised and only lowered when under sail or when the vessel is more than 60 nautical miles out at sea, away from land. So the crew were following the standard operating procedures of the manufacturers when that keel was up, right? People said, when the storm came in, why did they not lower the keel? If you haven't seen the recreation that we did, I recommend you go and see it. We did an episode of Super Yacht News with a 15-minute recreation, a timeline of events based on the MAIB report. And we did a dramatized recreation using various footage from other Perini Navi vessels, some real footages in there, some CCTV footage, some of the footage that was released after the sinking to show the vessel apparently having a blackout and things like that, which we don't think it did. And also the data is now being extracted from the yacht, and it tells a different story about that. So we'll go into that later if I remember. Now, as far as one of our contributors to the channel is a former Perini Navi chief engineer, had years of experience working on these vessels, and he said that the centerboard takes around 5 minutes to deploy fully. So you think about it, when that weather came in, they had little time, right? He said that that's the last thing they would have been thinking about, dropping the centerboard. They would have been more interested in getting up and running, bringing in the anchor, raising the anchor, turning the bow to the wind. They would have been confident of managing the situation. And he said, I'm sure they've been in similar situations before. Just the massive gust of 70 knot plus winds caught them out and knocked them down, and that was it. That's a direct quote from him. Now, when they built the vessel, all sailing vessels are meant to be able to be knocked down to 90 degrees. Knocked down means that the vessel is pushed over by the wind or by sea, and it goes down 90 degrees flat, and then it's meant to be able to raise back up to an upright position. Now, a lot of these racing sailing yachts, they can go 130 degrees, so they can go down, so they're underwater, and the sails are underwater like this. They're almost completely upside down, and then they can still right themselves. But this yacht was given a special dispensation because of its size by the UK registry that approved the build of this vessel, and they said that they would allow it to not have the ability to right itself at 90 degrees based on usage, it says in the report. I don't know what that means. The vessel should have had the ability to recover. There was another vessel that got knocked down in New Zealand. We showed video footage of it not long after the Bayesian sinking, and that vessel was knocked down by a severe wind in seconds, right down over there. There was a guy on watch, and the vessel righted itself. I don't think it went quite to 90, but it was as close as can be. And the vessel righted itself. So there was probably a lot of things broken on board, but the vessel survived. And that video, I'll play it here for those who are watching. That proves how quickly this can happen with these gusts of winds, like the one that the Bayesian was hit with, apparently. Now, another comment that comes up frequently is when you're at anchor, the boat will automatically face the wind as she swings on her anchor. So how did it get knocked down on its beam? The beam being the side of the ship. The vessel was dragging her anchor. Now, when a vessel starts to drag her anchor, the ability for the vessel to automatically, because obviously if it's swinging on the anchor and the wind is blowing this vessel, it's always going to point to forward, right? Because the anchor is holding it in that position. But when it starts to drag the anchor, that's no longer the case. So once it gets the vessel, from the CCTV footage we've seen, the vessel dragged her anchor as well as the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, based on the AIS data, and the Bayesian turned to starboard in that footage, that CCTV footage. And then the vessel was knocked down by the wind. So as it turned to starboard, because it was dragging her anchor, the vessel got knocked down, and that was the end of that. Moving on to the salvage. The salvage operation started around the first week in May. I'm not quite sure what day because I was traveling down here. I think it was around the 7th or 8th of May. It was probably a little bit earlier than that. When we arrived here, Hebolift 2 was here, but Hebolift 10 was not yet on site. It was down in Termini Americe, which is down the coast. And they had recovered the smaller boom or the tender boom of the Bayesian already before we started filming. And then on the 9th of May, the Bayesian claimed another life. One of the divers who was working on cutting the boom, the main boom, was killed in what we believe was an underwater explosion because of the equipment he was using. I'm not going to get into it technically because I don't know anything about it, but based on a report or an interview with Nick Sloan, who's a captain and a salvage expert who works for Smith Salvage. He's not here, but he's been doing a series of interviews, and he said that it was a buildup of hydrogen and oxygen, I believe, in this cutting tool, which caused an explosion, and that killed him. After his death, the salvage was suspended for 6 days, and whilst they investigated his death, obviously they need to make sure that if they go back to work, the same fate is not going to happen to another person, right? So they need to do an investigation. So 6 days passed. There was no activity. We believe. Then they raised the boom. We believe because initially they said they were going to leave the mast, the boom, and the rigging on the seabed, bring up the hull, and then they would bring up the rest of it later on. But then they brought up the boom first, and we believe that was because it was part of that investigation into the diver's death. Well, I can't verify that, but that's what I believe happened. The only thing that explains why they suddenly decided to raise it first. They also brought up the anchor. I believe this was the anchor that was out at the time, the one that they dragged 400 meters. Another comment that comes up a lot, and I saw it today actually, was why were they anchored in such deep water? Well, they weren't. They were anchored in more shallow water. They dragged their anchor into the 50-meter area where they sank. Now they cut that chain off, and that's the one that was out, no doubt, because they only brought one up, and the other one was still tucked away inside of the anchor pocket there, right? So they went back to work a week later, and the progress now is good. They've been using this tool, which I don't even know what the name of it is. It's like a giant, straw, and it blows air through it, and water jet, and they use it to basically blow away the soil or the seabed around the hull to give them space to work, so they can wrap this frame around the hull to allow them to raise it. That's as far as I know about that. The plan is to, once they've removed the mast and all of the other stuff that I mentioned earlier, they're going to right the yacht on the seabed. They're going to use a sling, I believe, to turn the hull to an upright position. Then they're going to raise the hull to the surface, and then once it's on the surface, because they believe the integrity of the hull is okay, so they're going to pump the water out of the hull, and so I assume it means that it will be able to float, and then they're going to tow the hull to Termini Americe, which is, like I said, about 11 miles or 17 kilometers down the coast. Now we'll move on to what we talked about, what I mentioned at the beginning, that the lawyer who's representing Ricardo Thomas, I assume he's representing the family of Ricardo Thomas. He was on a show, an Italian show, called Quarta Repubblica, and he was talking about what he believes may have been happening on the night, and why it may have resulted in the sinking of the vessel. Now it's been translated from Italian, so it's a little bit, I had to clean it up a little bit, so it doesn't, it might, if it sounds a bit weird, the way it's worded, it's because it's translated from Italian. And also there was like 4 people talking all over each other in this show, so it's really hard to translate it. But the lawyers, whose name I don't have here, he said that this is his theory. He says, I would not be surprised if it turns out that the crew, or parts of the crew, at the most dangerous moment were not on board. From when the boat takes on water to when it turns takes time, because we've seen the images that show the lights go out, which is not accurate. The electricity goes out because there is flooding of the engines when the vessel is still horizontal. That's incorrect. So this flooding lasts quite a while, and in this time that is quantified, I guess he means because of the video, there are those who say 15 minutes, there are those who say much more, and there's nobody intervenes. He says the lights go out, no one starts the engines, no one puts the ship to the bow, the ship's bow to the wind, no one does the actions that you don't need to be Checo Bruni to understand what needs to be done, elementary actions. I guess that's a famous sailing Italian guy. I don't know who that is. I should have checked before I started this, but I didn't. He says, and why the captain and crew, they did not carry out these operations, either because, I don't know, he disappeared, he's talking about the captain, or he was really asleep for some reason. He and all the others, or saying they were all asleep, or it's not possible, or it's possible that they were not on board. They had gone away at that moment. The moment they realized that the sea is rising and the storm is approaching, they quickly returned to the ship. He said this was to explain the circumstances. It's clear that they keep the tender in the water because in the morning the chef would go to buy food for the owner. So the tender was in the water, and they could have used it to go out and to come back. And the water that flooded for a long time, where did the water in the engine room come from? So that's what he says. Like I said, it's a bit broken because that's just the way it was translated. But you get the drift. He's basically saying that that the engine room was flooded while the vessel was still upright. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And there was a blackout, which we don't believe it was the case. I think it's been proven now by the Marine Accident Investigation Branch's report. They say that the vessel, the engines only stopped, the generators, should I say, only stopped when the vessel was knocked down, which would make sense because they would be starved of fuel. And then the emergency generator, they have battery backup. They don't have emergency generator on this vessel, but they have a battery system that turned on the emergency lights. So the vessel was powered until the vessel got knocked down. Now, the video footage that they're referring to is a CCTV camera footage that showed the vessel, that appeared to show the vessel's lights going out. I was never convinced. I was never convinced that video footage actually showed the lights going out, because they said that the lights on top stayed on and the rest of them went out. Well, the visibility on that night was so bad, and the vessel was pushed away from the camera, and I think that as the vessel turned, it just disappeared into the bad quality of that camera and the terrible weather they had. It just made it appear that the lights had gone out, but I don't think they ever did. So that's not proof. So I don't believe the lights did go out. And I think the fact that the Marine Accident Investigation Branch is saying that when the vessel was knocked down, the lights went out, that's probably because they've got the records from the AMS system on board, which is the alarm and monitoring system, which all vessels have. All modern vessels have this system. I've showed them in my yacht tours many times. Whenever I go on the bridge, I show you the controls, and it shows you the ballast and how much fuel is in the tanks and all that stuff. And that's called an AMS system. And they will have had, every time you do anything on the vessel, it creates a log in the AMS system, and they've retrieved that system, I believe, and that's what they've used. Corroboration of eyewitnesses plus that data will show, I have no doubt, that the vessel's power only went out when the vessel got knocked down. So that footage that we've seen time and time again on the news of the vessel apparently having a blackout is not accurate. He says that nobody intervenes, and he says that he believes that the engineer was ashore when this happened, and that's why he didn't intervene. Now, the MAIB report says that in the story, the recreation we've done, the engineer wakes up, he goes in the engine room, he switches on the generators. That will be verified by the AMS system, right? So he's gone into the engine room, started up the generators, he went up to the bridge, he started all of the pumps for the bow thrusters and the steering, and then the captain asked the chief officer to go down. He was on the fly bridge, go down to the wheelhouse, and he met the engineer there, and he said, yeah, everything's ready to go. And it was just at that moment when the vessel got knocked down. So the engineer was on board. He started the engines. He started the generators. Sorry, I keep saying engines. He started the generators for manoeuvring. He started all 3 generators. I think there were 4 generators on board, but he started 3 generators, and then he told the chief officer, yes, everything's ready to go. Now, the idea that the only engineer is ashore in the boat, it doesn't make any sense. And there's a number of reasons, and this is the way yachts are operated. First of all, the boat being in the water, the tender being in the water, that some vessels do that. They'll put the tender on the line, on the stern of the vessel. They'll close the shell door and they'll just leave it there overnight. And that's because in the morning, when you've got guests on, tender operations, especially on a small yacht. I know it's a big sailing yacht, but it's a small vessel. It's only got 2 decks. The tender operations is noisy and it will wake up the guests, so they don't want to do that. So they leave the boat in the water, and then they just pull it in on the line, open the shell. They open the shell door, pull it in the line, they get in, and they can go off. Right? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the engineer goes ashore. He would not go ashore in the tender and then stay ashore with the tender just moored in the marina. That never happens. The tender is always with the boat. So even if he did go ashore, someone would take him ashore in the boat. He would get off, and then the boat would go back, and it would be with the yacht. It's always the way it is. They never go ashore and keep the tender ashore, because the next person who needs to use it, the boat's not there, right? So the idea that he would just get in it and go ashore himself doesn't make any sense either, because you can't do it, because somebody has to let him out. He has to open the shell door. It doesn't work. Now, let's just say, for instance, that he's ashore, and the lawyer says because he was ashore, nobody answered the alarms in the engine room. Well, that's incorrect, because the way a system works on board is everybody who bridge watch and the engineers on this vessel, there's only 1 engineer, but they all have an alarm panel in their cabin. So the captain has one, the chief officer has one, the deck guys on this boat probably have one. Usually it's officers, so there'll be like the second officer, the chief officer, the captain, the chief engineer, and the other engineers. On a vessel that I worked on where there's multiple engineers, they all have an alarm panel. And the way that system works is the engineers panel is first. So if there's an alarm, it sounds in the engineer's cabin. If he doesn't answer it within a minute, let's say, then you have a backup system. So on that panel, you can program who's next. So if after a minute there's no response, it will sound in the captain's cabin and the chief officer's cabin. And I'm reliably informed that on this vessel, or on Perini Navi yachts, there's a panel in every cabin, every crew cabin. So they will turn off the ones that the crew, that like the stewardess doesn't need to know what's going on in the engine room, so they'll turn those off probably. I believe some captains have them all operating, so everyone gets woken up. So, but there is no scenario where an alarm goes unanswered. So that deals with that issue. Now, another thing about working on yachts is when there are guests on board, the shore leave for crew is cancelled. Now, there are exceptions, very few exceptions. I've worked on vessels where I've joined a vessel, I've worked for 10 weeks, and I've not gone ashore in 10 weeks because the owner's been on board the entire time. And when I leave, he's still on board. And then I leave, and that's the first time I've stepped ashore in 10 weeks. I've worked on a yacht where I was on board for 3 months, and I only got 1 day where I was able to go ashore, and that's because the owner left, and he went for a meeting in Florida. He flew from the Bahamas to Florida, and that was 1 day, and I didn't even get the day off because I still had to work, but I got some time off in the afternoon to go ashore for 3 months, 12 weeks, or more than 12 weeks. That's generally the way things are. It depends on who you are. In that time, other people got to go ashore, because there were multiple people of the discipline. So the stewardesses, if there's 5 stewardesses, if the owner lives on board, that's usually when that rule of no shore leave is dealt with differently, because the owner lives on board and he's always on board. So the crew need to have a little bit of downtime if it's for months. If they're not on a full rotation, so if I'm doing 10 weeks on and 10 weeks off, then I don't get any time off. If they stewardesses are working for 5 months in a row. They can't make them work for 5 months and not give them a day off, so they get a little bit of time off here and there. But that's the exception. And generally, and this vessel was boss on, guest on. They were full. That's a big deal. Most yachts, they have a capacity of 12 people, but they only have 3 or 4 people on. The owner and his wife and maybe a couple of kids or something, and that's enough for the crew. It's very, very stressful working, even when you've only got a couple of people on. You think it would be easy, but it's not. When you've got a full contingent of guests on board, and there are actually more guests than crew on this boat. That's a big deal. The idea that they're going to go and party in the middle of the night when they're already probably only getting 6 hours sleep is crazy, right? The hours of rest that we're supposed to have 8 hours of rest in a 24-hour period, and we rarely get it when boss is on, and this crew were probably maxed out. They were probably all fatigued, exhausted, because the owner had been on for at least a month. As far, my records only went back, I think they went back 6 or 7 weeks, and the owner had been on the entire time. So the crew would have been exhausted. And the following day, the 19th, the day that the yacht sank, the guests were meant to be leaving from here, from Porticello, and the yacht was going for a refit period, and the crew would have got downtime then. That's when the crew gets the downtime. The owner leaves, the yacht is either laid up somewhere, waiting for them to come back, and then the crew gets some downtime. The captain will reduce their hours. They'll just have a normal 9 till 5, and then maybe probably get weekends off, depending on if they're on rotation or not. That's how it works. And this idea that the crew were going ashore and partying and stuff like that is it's nonsensical. So the idea that the crew were not on board is false. And the idea that because, let's just say, one of them was ashore, which I don't think he was, but let's just say the engineer was missing, he's saying that it means that the alarms would go unanswered. I've already explained that that's not true either. That's not how it works at all. So there are a lot of holes in that theory. I think that I was going to bring this up, 10 days ago. I said I'm going to talk about the lawyer and what he said, and then the next day the MAIB report was released, and we got sidetracked and we went into that, and when we did that, I thought, well, this kind of blows a hole in that theory anyway, because they talk about the engineer waking up and going in the engine room and starting the generators, and that will all be confirmed by the AMS system, the alarm and monitoring system on board. So there you go. So that's as far as I'm concerned, the lawyer is just lawyering, and he doesn't, obviously, clearly has no experience working on a yacht, but that's the way it works on every yacht I worked on, and I've not met anyone who's said anything differently about how their yacht operated. Like I said, the MAIB report came out, and we went into in that video. I'll post a link below here if you haven't seen it. If you don't want to watch the whole, it's because it's like a 25-minute video, and it's got in the middle of it, it's got that recreation. I've also posted it on the SuperYacht news channel, which is where we post shorter versions of all of our videos. I'll post a link to that as well. That's just purely the 15-minute timeline of events with the recreation to give you a visible idea of what was happening. In the MAIB report, the investigation examined the published weather forecasts for the period, some actual weather observations from the night of the 18th and 19th of August, evidence from local closed-circuit television footage and witness testimony. This was combined with the output of an Italian weather report for the area, the Meteo France weather bulletin for the western part of the Mediterranean, issued at 0900 UTC on the 18th of August, so that's 9 o'clock in the morning, UTC time, so that would have been 10 o'clock local time, was issued on the 18th of August, so that was the day before the vessel sank. Mentioned a deepening low pressure feature moving towards Italy from the Gulf of Genoa during the period. Specifically, the 24-hour forecast included the north coast of Sicily and offshore areas and predicted westerly 3 to 4, I suppose that's gale force winds, temporarily northwest overnight, then increasing to 4 or 5 in the south at the end. Seas smooth or slight, becoming slight or moderate in the second part of the night. There was forecast to be poor visibility and showers or thunderstorms. Nothing about 70-knot winds, right? Early Italian weather forecasts ahead of the accident predicted intense or persistent rain, mainly in the form of showers or thunderstorms. Storms accompanied by strong wind gusts. So there's a mention of strong winds. At 2100 hours UTC, on the 18th of August, Italian forecasters issued a gale warning of northwesterly gale force 8 winds for Sardinia and Corsica, with associated isolated thunderstorms with local gusts for Sicily. This was updated and reiterated at midnight on the 19th of August 2024. 0352 hours on the 19th of August, around 5 nautical miles to the northwest of Porticello Anchorage, which was where the Bayesian was, winds were recorded to have suddenly increased from 5 knots to 41 knots from the northwest. These strong winds were associated with the storm front that passed quickly towards the rugged coastline near Bagheria and Porticello, which is this location here. This was observed on a nearby vessel's navigational radar, which they showed a photograph of, which I'll put on screen for the YouTube watchers. Several CCTV cameras in Porticello showed an intense squall of wind and heavy rain arriving, throwing debris around violently before moving on. This intense squall was associated with lightning strikes, thunder, and very poor visibility. Land weather readings recorded at 5-minute or hourly intervals captured a peaking of wind strength as the intense squall passed. The Met Office, which is the UK Weather Office, study of satellite imagery indicated that the mesocyclonic storm front was demonstrating the properties of a significant supercell with associated downdrafts and possible near-surface winds in excess of 100 miles per hour or 87 knots. The study concluded that a mesocyclonic storm was highly likely. So that was something that they were not expecting. Supercell is an isolated mesocyclonic storm that contains updrafts of wind that rotate about a vertical axis. Supercells produce damaging winds and hail and can produce tornadoes or tornadic waterspouts. The thunderstorms have associated updrafts and downdrafts. Updraft associated winds can be tornadic or in character and can be associated with winds from 56 to over 175 knots. A downdraft is where precipitation and wind falls from the storm. Downdraft associated winds can be intense and cause damage when they reach the surface. So that's the weather that they experienced apparently. Now these can be super specific as well in the where they hit, because a lot of people keep saying, well, the other vessel was okay, why did that not suffer the same fate? The wind, if there was a downdraft, which the Italian Air Force actually said that there was one, they can be super specific to a certain area. So the wind can be stronger where the Bayesian was, even though the other vessel's only a few hundred meters away. So that could be a reason why the other vessel survived. It could be that the other vessel, the captain of that vessel said he was expecting weather and already had his engines running, and he was a very experienced captain in this area. I don't know if the captain of the Bayesian was as experienced as he was, but he was already on the bridge. He had all of his crew awake, and they were already raised their anchor, and they had the bow turned to the wind, which is what the Bayesian crew were preparing to do when the weather hit. Now, the MAIB, they contracted the University of Southampton, the Wolfson Unit for Marine Technology and Industrial Aerodynamics. They were commissioned to undertake a study and first built a stability model of the Bayesian that replicated the information contained in the approved stability information booklet, which is the booklet that was given by Perini Navi to the owner of the yacht after it was completed. Now, in that booklet, the investigation established that in the assumed loss condition, which means the amount of equipment that was on board, the amounts of provisions and everything, that that all changes the stability of a vessel. And they went with an assumed load because they didn't know the exact numbers, but they said that the wind speeds were in excess of 60. Well, they said wind speeds of in excess of 63.4 knots on the beam was sufficient to knock Bayesian over. It is possible that Bayesian was similarly vulnerable to winds of less than 63.4 knots. These vulnerabilities, when in a motoring condition with sails lowered, the centerboard raised, and 10% consumables on board, this is the load condition they were talking about, they were not identified in the stability information booklet carried on board. Consequently, these vulnerabilities were also unknown to either the owner or the crew of Bayesian. So there was information missing, important information missing from the stability booklet, which meant that the crew were completely unaware of what might happen in those circumstances. Now, the Met Office study and local observations indicated the probable transient presence of hurricane-force winds well in excess of 64 knots at the time of the accident. These winds were sufficient to knock Bayesian beyond its angle of vanishing stability. The Wilson unit study of Bayesian determined that the 72-metre tall mast accounted for 50% of the total wind heeling moment of the vessel when the wind was exactly on the beam. So 50% of the heeling moment, so that 50% of what made the vessel list over was just from that mast. The remainder was predominantly made up of the rigging and furled sails. The profile of the mast also produced a degree of effective lift, delivering an increase in the heeling moment applied by the wind, peaking in winds about 20 degrees off the bow. Important information missing from the stability booklet, which meant that the captain was in the dark about certain information or certain required knowledge of that yacht. In the report, it says that the Bayesian, when it was built in 2008, at the time it was named Salute. The stability information booklet was submitted for approval to Ensign, the then large yacht service of the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, on the 3rd of July. The stability information booklet was approved against the requirements of Section 11 of the Merchant Shipping Notice, the Large Commercial Yacht Code. The approved SIB was required to include curves of statical stability, or GZ curves, for specific loaded conditions, including at least the load departure and arrival conditions with 100% and 10% consumables respectively. GZ curves were required to have a positive range of not less than 90 degrees. In other words, the vessel, when it was loaded with up to 100% or down to 10% of consumables, the vessel must be able to recover from a 90-degree knockdown. However, Large Yacht Code 2 allowed for vessels of more than 45 meters in length to have a GZ range of less than 90 degrees, subject to agreed operational criteria. Derived wind heeling levers were also to be calculated for sailing vessels. Bayesian's SIB contained curves for the sailing conditions when at maximum load, contractual full load, and the light load condition. In all three conditions, the centerboard had to be lowered. The respective angles of vanishing stability for the three conditions recorded in the stability information booklet were 91.4 degrees, 92.3 degrees, and 84.3 degrees respectively. Stability information booklet contained curves of maximum steady heel angle to prevent downflooding in squalls. These curves provided a safe operational range for the sailing vessel, indicating the maximum heel angle it could withstand before there was a risk of downflooding occurring in a sudden gust or squall. The SIB did not contain such curves for when Bayesian was operating in a motoring condition with the centerboard, where the centerboard was raised and no sails were up. So it had information in there for when it was under sail with the centerboard down, but it didn't have information for when it was motoring. So it was using its engines and wasn't using its sails with its centerboard up. Remember, the centerboard was said in that same booklet that it should always be in the up position unless they were under sail or more than 60 nautical miles out at sea. A very different story than what was put out there by Mr. Constantino, right? The stability book had certain figures in there, but they were not. There was missing information in there that meant the crew were unawares of certain conditions in certain weather. Quite an incredible set of circumstances. The Swiss cheese model comes to mind. There's information missing from this booklet. The crew were preparing to maneuver. The captain asked the chief officer, go and check that the generators are running and that they were ready to go with the pumps and stuff on the bridge. The chief officer goes down to the bridge. He meets the engineer there and he says, yeah, we're all ready to go. And that chief goes back up to the captain and says, we're all good. And then they're just about to start moving and then boom, they get knocked down. So the timing was just really unfortunate. Now, going back to one of the things he said early on, Mr. Constantino, was that all of the guests should have been in their life jackets at the muster stations, right? Because they knew this weather was coming in. Well, they didn't know that weather was coming in at all. They knew there was weather coming in, but early on, in those last 20 minutes or so, the owner, Mrs. Bacaris, she went up to the bridge to talk to the captains and say, are we going to be cancelling the taxis? Because everybody was meant to be leaving that morning. All of the guests were meant to be leaving that morning a few hours later. And she went up to the bridge and said, is this weather meaning that we're not going to be able to leave? Are you going to cancel the taxis? So in her mind, there was no immediate danger because, she's been in that weather before. There's a different, people saying, oh, there was a storm, everyone should have been mustered ready to go, right? Well, you don't do that every time there's a storm because you have storms all the time. And the weather conditions were, where the captain said before he went to bed and left the deckhand on the bridge, wake me if the winds get over 20 knots, or if you feel like we're dragging the anchor, wake me under those conditions, right? I would certainly recommend that you watch that timeline of events. But anyway, that brings us up to date with what's happening here. Like I said, the salvage is ongoing. They've been using this giant tool to blow the soil away from underneath the hull of the vessel. They've finished that now, it would seem. They moved on to the next phase of the salvage based on our monitoring of what's happening here. There's not been any press releases or any releases from the company, but we've seen that they've stopped doing that now and they seem to be working on the next phase. So we are covering that on the channel, on the main channel, the Yacht Report channel, so you should check it out if you haven't already. And we do have live feeds, not every day. Most days we've had live feeds. We've been plagued with problems with this live feed. It's become such a labor intensive thing to do. It's very difficult to run a live feed, especially when you're using drones. And we are restricted in where we can fly here, so we're struggling to get close. We have a secret weapon on its way. It's not a weapon, but it's a figure of speech. But we've got something coming that will help us to get closer, so the live feed will be much better. And obviously, when they pull that boat out of the water, we are going to show that on the channel. Now, if you're not into live feeds, I know there's a lot of people questioning why is this here. Well, a lot of people like the live feeds. Every time we have it, it's like a community of people who talk in the comments, and they talk about this, they talk about other things. They're talking about what's happening in the feed, but they're talking about the incident itself, and they talk about all kinds of stuff. And it's like I said, it's like a community. So there are people who like it. A lot of them are people that I believe were not watching the channel before. So it's a different audience, if you like. So if you don't like it, if you're not interested in it, keep watching the channel. We are doing periodic updates with the highlights, if you like, of what's happening on those live feeds. So just look out for those. The live feeds are very clearly marked. It says live feed, and it has the date, and it says Bayesian Salvage in the thumbnail, so there's no misunderstanding of what it is. And it says live on it and everything like that. So yeah, if you're not into that, you know, that's okay. Just give those ones a miss. And if you do like the live feeds, or if you're interested, check them out. I mean, I'm sure they'll get more interesting when they start to raise this thing up, right? At the moment, there's an awful lot of work going on underwater, and not that much work going on the surface. So, but stay tuned, and yeah, and keep watching the main channel, and we'll bring you the footage when that vessel comes up. All right, guys, I think I'm going to wrap up. There's going to be a portion of this video, or of this podcast, is going to be on the main channel as a separate video. So yeah, if you are a podcast listener and you don't watch the main channel, check it out. We'll put links and all that stuff below on YouTube. And if you're listening to it on Spotify and stuff, check us out on YouTube on the Yacht Report, the main channel. We have a YouTube channel called the Yacht Report Podcast as well. So all the links will be below this video. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, place them below, and we'll get into it in the comments. All right, bye-bye.